Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Weep Union, and in this one there are several developments all across the front line. The Russians have a net gain of approximately 29 square kilometers, advancing within and to the east of Vovchansk in the north, reaching the outskirts of Kupiansk north of the town on the western bank of the Usk river line. The Russians also managed to advance west of the Serebets river line, while the Ukrainians counterattacked in the Toretsk direction. The Russians managed to advance and gain control over a fortified position west of Bilorivka. The Russians also managed to gain several positions east of Pokrovsk, in between Toretsk and Pokrovsk. The Russians made additional advances to the west of Kurakhove, gaining control over Odratna and some positions around the town. The Russians also managed to advance to the southwestern outskirts of the Donetsk region. Starting out in the south, the Russians have managed to gain control over additional parts of Zelenopole, pushing the Ukrainians to the outskirts of the town. They also managed to gain control over 3 separate fortified positions here to the east of Zelenopole, gain control over additional roads in the eastern parts of the town, additional forest lines covering the eastern parts and the northern parts of the town, allowing them to start fighting over the fortified positions north of Zelenopole and to push the Ukrainians out of the town itself. While there's been no advances by the Russians in the south in the direction of Novopil, the Russians are here working on the fortified positions and the town to the north, after which they'll work on towards the border area between the Donetsk and Zaporizhia regions, which will open the road for the Russian forces in the direction of Kupiansk. The Russians are here looking to gain control of both towns before moving on northwards towards Shevchenko and Kupiansk, which will allow them to start fighting over the next defensive line of the Ukrainians here in the Donetsk region. At the same time, the Russians are flanking Fedorivka from the east, gain control over some fortified positions and forest lines to the east of the town along the Mokry Yali river line. The Russians already control Vesele, where fighting is taking place over the fortified position to the northwest of the town, as well as the defensive line to the south of it. Gain control over the eastern flank of Fedorivka will allow the Russians to start operations towards the town itself from both the eastern and southern directions. Also allow the Russians, following the capture of Odratna, to fight in the direction of Kumar further north. We see that the Russians have managed to gain full control over Odratna. This was a 3-step process. The Russians managed to reach the outskirts of Odratna, where fighting started taking place at the outskirts of the town from the east and from the south. The second part was allow Russians gaining a foothold in the town, gain control of the eastern and southern outskirts of it, while fighting continued over the central and western parts of it, following which additional assaults took place in the eastern and southern flanks, but the Russians also made an additional push from the southwestern direction, where they launched an attack from 3 separate directions from the south, southwest, and north, allowing them to gain full control over the town. The Russians waving their flag within the town of Odratna was geolocated with this footage here. So based on this, we can see that the Russians have gained full control over Odratna following the capture of Bahatir. The Russians will now look to clear the southern bank of the Vovchansk river line here in the direction of Bahatir, and clear the road towards Kumar for offensive operations from the southern and eastern directions to gain control over the entire eastern bank of the Mokry Yali river line, which will significantly improve the tactical situation for the Russian forces here in the southwestern outskirts of the Donetsk region and open the road for further offensive operations towards the defensive line of the Ukrainians from Oleksivka to Dashne. To the east of Pokrovsk, the Russians managed to gain control over several fortified positions, advancing both northeast of Novolenivka and northwest of Novopoltavka. The Russians have gained control over the first line to the south of Popiv Yar, as well as the fortified positions in the direction of the main road connecting Novopoltavka to Popiv Yar. The Russians will now be able to start offensive operations to gain a foothold within both Poltavka and Popiv Yar, with 2 separate roads to drive into these towns. Russians will look to gain a foothold, then fight over the central parts, and then gain full control over both towns, allowing them to move on towards Rusin Yar in the east and the defensive line in the west. It's likely that the Russians will rely on gaining control over this area, secure themselves, entrench themselves before moving up in a northeastern and southwestern direction, both towards Kupiansk in the northeast and Pokrovsk in the southwest. These advances by the Russians across the main highway from Pokrovsk to Kupiansk has significantly improved the Russian positions in the area. They'll be able to bypass some of the fortified positions to the southwest, allowing them to align the front line with the defensive line that is connecting to Druzhkivka with Pokrovsk, which is already being struck by Russian drones. Also allow the Russians to bypass fortified positions to the northeast, allowing them to align the front line with Kostiantynivka in the eastern direction to cut off the road between Kostiantynivka and Druzhkivka by gaining fire control over it. This allowed the Russians to significantly improve their positions in regards to the siege of Kostiantynivka and the siege of Pokrovsk, which will take place simultaneously from the eastern and western directions. The Russians have also managed to advance here west of Bilorivka, gaining control over some fortified positions in the area. Gaining control of this fortified position opens the road for the next defensive position, which is here connecting the first lines that connects Bilorivka with Serebryanka in the wider angle, and then it also allows the Russians to move through the first patch area to flank the fortified positions in the southern parts of Ryurivka, where the Russians can launch assaults from the northern, eastern, and southern flanks now to gain control of these fortified positions in first patches, to allow the Russians to continue advancing in the direction of Serebryanka and secure Ryurivka. This takes place following the Russian foothold gain within Ryurivka itself, and also the Russian full capture of Vovchansk. The Russians will be looking to gain control of the fortified positions east of the defensive line just outside Siversk, allowing them to start fighting over the defensive line itself, both from the direction of Vovchansk and from this direction of Serebryanka and Ryurivka. In the direction of Toretsk, the Ukrainians managed to launch a counterattack, cutting off the eastern supply route of the Russian forces. This leaves only the first lines to supply their forces here in the central parts and northern parts of Toretsk. The Ukrainians have already cut off the northern flank of the Russian forces. Now cutting off the eastern flank completely cuts off the Russians from any roads that they have available. The period is now in the summer period, 23rd of May, which means that the fields are generally usable for logistics. However, the gap has closed significantly, which means that the Russian forces supplying their forces working within Toretsk will be very exposed to Ukrainian drones and direct fire from the northern and southern flanks. This means that the Russian forces within Toretsk have been operationally encircled. It is reported that the Ukrainians are mainly using the sewer systems to move around here within Toretsk, which allows them to pop up in areas that the Russians have already cleared, especially from across in the direction of Zarishne. They can constantly send reinforcements through underground pipelines. To the north in the direction of Rikodup, the Russians have managed to expand their foothold within the town, securing it and moving along both the northern and southern roads. The Russians are here slowly moving along to gain control of the northern flank, while moving into the southern flank towards the central parts of the town to gain control over the school area, which will act as a base of operations for further offensive operations towards the western residential area and the northern farm area. Gaining control over Rikodup will secure the northern flank of Nove, with Lipove securing the southern flank. The Russians will have a bubble around Nove, securing the town as a logistical hub for further offensive operations in the northern, western, and southern directions. To the north, the Russians have advanced in the direction of Kupiansk, reaching the outskirts of the town. The Russians have gained control over Radkivka and half of Kindashivka. Following the capture of the fortified positions, the Russians had an open road to Kindashivka. They've managed to gain a foothold in the northern parts. They also split into two groups to attack from the eastern parts as well. This allowed them to gain a secure foothold within the town and push the Ukrainians to the western parts of it. They pushed further southwards, bypassing the positions of the Ukrainians in the western parts along the main highway and advancing towards Radkivka, gaining control over some fortified positions in the western and eastern parts of the town. They followed up with an assault from the eastern direction towards Radkivka as well. This allowed them to start fighting along the main highway both to the southeast and southwest of Radkivka. They're looking to pincer the Ukrainian positions within the western parts of Kindashivka by advancing along the main highway from the northern and southern directions to gain control of the fortified positions and cut off the remaining parts of Kindashivka from Tushenikivka. Also allowed the Russians to start fighting over Kupiansk itself, where the fortified positions here to the south of Holyubivka and the northern outskirts of the town will be under attack by the Russian forces. The Russians here continue offensive operations towards Kupiansk. By securing these towns along the main highway, they'll have secured parts of the highway towards the town, while the Ukrainians still have positions such as Melashevkivka and Tishinkivka, which allows them to have direct fire control over the highway. The Russians gain control of both of those as well. The road to Kupiansk will be directly open. Russians will also be able to expand towards Moskovka, cutting off the railway in the northwestern direction, significantly limiting the Ukrainian supply lines in the direction of Kupiansk, allowing them to bypass the town to cut off further supply lines further south. At the same time, getting control of the western bank of the Oskar River line here near Kupiansk will open up the road for Russian offensive operations here southwest of Sinkivka along the first patch area and into Petropavlivka to re-enter the town both in the direction of Kupiansk in the eastern bank of the Oskar River line and the direction of Petropavlivka, flanking the fortified positions of the Ukrainians in the area. Russians have secured Kostinikivka in the south, which will allow them for further offensive operations in the northern direction to the southern flank of Kupiansk, and the Russians will likely attempt additional crossings in the direction of Sinkova to gain control over the town and launch offensive operations from the south of Kupiansk. Kupiansk will now draw a lot of the Ukrainian supplies and manpower from this section of the front line to the town. Now that the Russians have reached the outskirts of it, the Ukrainians will attempt to launch some counterattacks to cut off the supplies of the Russian forces and improve their positions in this section of the front line. Moving on to the Vovchansk direction, the Russians have managed to advance along the Vovcha river line east of the town, getting control over additional forest lines and forest patches. As they move to gain control over this additional forest patch here to the north of Sibine and Vovchansk Kotori, the Russians also advancing here east of Tigre to gain control of some forest patches in that direction. At the same time, the Russians also managed to advance further within Vovchansk itself. The Russians have now cut off the residential area in the central parts of the town from the eastern outskirts of it. The Russians are here working to gain full control over the northern parts of Vovchansk, which will allow them to start offensive operations across the Vovcha river line, at the same time to gain control over a wider area of the Vovcha river line. If Russians are able to gain a foothold across the Vovcha river line, they'll be able to start fighting over the southern parts of Vovchansk, and we can see that the highway connects Vovchansk here in the west with Kupiansk and the Odratna here in the east. The Russians will look to gain full control over this highway in any large offensive operation taking place in the future, for their offensive operations to reach the direction of Izium in the south, which will allow them to strengthen their siege over the Sloviansk-Konstantinivka line in the Donetsk region. Talking of a larger Russian offensive, Putin said yesterday that the Russians have taken the decision to create a buffer zone along the entire front line from Chernihiv region in the north all the way to Kharkiv in the east. The Russian objective will be to launch offensive operations across the border area, create a buffer zone between the Russian and Ukrainian border that spans the entire border zone. It is likely to start with that the Russians will be planning on a 15-kilometer deep zone. We are already seeing areas from which the Russians can launch these operations from. The Russians have had activities in the Bryansk region, in the direction of Chernihiv, in the Sumy region, both in the northern, eastern, and southern parts of it. They have also gained a foothold across in the Kharkiv region. The Russians may look to gain control over the highway here connecting Kupiansk to Vovchansk, at the same time connecting the buffer zone here in the northern parts of Kharkiv all the way to the western parts of the border area, and then expand their foothold across the Sumy region and connect it with the Kharkiv region there as well. This will also allow the Russians to launch operations here in the northern parts, where they will look to gain control over some forest patches and the northern parts of the front line. It is unlikely that the Russians will launch any significant operation in the north because of the heavy forest areas, which allows for Ukrainian forces to use guerrilla tactics, which allows them to fight a much larger force with a smaller grouping of forces. However, in the eastern section of the front line, the Ukrainians would need to respond with a significant amount of forces, which can significantly weaken their eastern and southern parts of the front line, which will allow the Russians to step up their offensive operations from the Zaporizhia region in the south and through the Donetsk and Kharkiv regions in the east. The Ukrainians are already reporting that the Russian forces are gathering troops in the border area, both in the Belgorod and in the Kursk region. This means that it is likely that the Russians will soon launch their offensive operation, their summer offensive that has been long expected. And this offensive may prove completely decisive in terms of the endgame of this war. It can be the very endgame of it, as the Russians gaining significant control over the border areas between the Sumy and Kharkiv regions will allow them to significantly widen the front line, limiting the Ukrainian ability to spread out their forces in a sustainable manner. and the Russians are significantly outpacing the Ukrainian recruitments and building of weapons, which means that in the long term, even if no significant amount of territory is gained, if the Russians simply widen the front line, they'll be able to speed up the end of the war. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.